Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We have quite a number of things we're going to cover over the next couple of hours. This hour is kind of an open line, so I'd love to get your comments, although I have quite a number of things I'm going to put on the table. But then starting on our national hour, next hour, we have, first of all, Samuel Rodriguez, I guess I should call him, since, of course, he is the head of a very prominent Hispanic organization. And he has actually been to the border. We have one of the articles that comes from Christian newspaper that gives you a little bit of an idea, toured the detention facility, and really was very upset about the way in which the media has presented some of this, including some of the comments by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So wanted to give you a chance to hear from him for about a half an hour, and if you have any questions or comments or pushback, he's on the program with us. Then from 1:30 to 2 o'clock, Martin Mawyer is going to be with us. This is another kind of controversial issue. We have these Muslim community patrols in New York City, and he is contending that they have an extra agenda apart from just keeping people safe. That has been challenged in various news organizations, and even Snopes.com has had some questions. So we're going to get into that and give you a chance to read it yourself. There's a PDF that goes with this, so you can actually read all about what they have done in terms of an investigative report. And that fills up the second hour. Then the third hour, Michael Youssef will be with us. Very interesting book, Counting Stars in an Empty Sky. Actually, when I got the book, I thought it was all about promises that God has given to us, because the Bible is full of promises. And I was thinking, well, that was kind of the idea of the counting in the stars. Then I got into it, I realized, no, he's really talking about the 7 promises to Abraham and his following, including the nation of Israel. So that will be an interesting discussion. And then I do have a last half hour to kind of pick up some of the pieces that I will start this hour and maybe not get to until a little bit later, especially with an audience that probably will be hearing some of that for the very first time. So if that gives you an overview, I hope you really stay tuned, because we're going to actually go through 3 different guests in about an hour and a half in the middle of the program. And each one of them are talking about very important issues that I think you will want to interact with. And please, if you do want to ask a question, call immediately. Nothing more frustrating than to say goodbye to Martin Mawyer, and then the next hour somebody says, I want to talk about what he said last hour. And, of course, half the listeners didn't hear the interview or can't remember all of it or whatever. So if you can, call during the segments in which we are talking about these very important issues. Well, the theme that runs through a good portion of this hour today goes back to a phrase that has been attributed, I think accurately so, to the senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And I've sort of updated it, but basically what he said back then was kind of just for men, but I'm going to say for people. Basically, if I can paraphrase it slightly, what he said is people certainly are entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And this is something that I don't have on the website, although if some of these articles are of interest to you, we can post them or make connections to them. But over the last about 18 hours here, as I've gone out on the internet, as I've gone out on Facebook and I'm seeing more and more of these examples. And so I thought it sometimes is helpful to put them all together kind of in a basket so that it makes some sense. And that is to recognize that a lot of people in America are making decisions based upon false information. And more importantly, those American voters are making decisions on false information. So since the last couple of days, we've been talking about shooting. I will go back to an article that actually came out a while back, but it's one that I saw posted just more recently because of the shooting. And that is the title of the article, which is from the Washington Post. And it's always amazing when I bring some of these people up. They say, well, you're biasing that. Well, Washington Post is not exactly written by and run by individuals that would agree with people sitting around this table. But nevertheless, the article is most Americans incorrectly think gun murder rates have gotten worse, not better. And if you go into the article, you'll recognize that what they noticed is that people in different parts of the country have different perceptions about that, but almost uniformly, Americans believe that the murder rates have gone up. And perhaps the one where there was the greatest split is one of those particular demographic groups that may elect the Democratic candidate or might re-elect Donald Trump. And yet their perception of the world oftentimes is very inaccurate. And what we're talking about is this demographic category of suburban and small town women who were 29 points more likely to say that the gun murder rate is now higher than it was in 1994. Well, first of all, let me just give you the rest of the story. That is wrong. You can look at data from the FBI that breaks out reported murders by type of weapon, shows a very significant drop in that regard since a peak in 1993. You can also, if you want to dig into that a little bit more, even go to the research done by the CDC and others. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But so first of all, the number of murders since 1994, when Bill Clinton actually wanted to put into this, for example, by targeting violent crime, put into effect an assault weapons ban, then that has dropped precipitously. I've seen some people on the internet saying, well, yeah, it dropped because of the assault weapons ban. No, it dropped anyway. And after the assault weapons ban was removed, it continued to drop. So the argument that that was why it dropped, I think, can be set aside, but we can leave that argument for another day. But this particular article in the Washington Post went on to say, remember that the question was asked about the murder rate, and that is the number of murders in comparison to the population. And since 1994, the population's gone up significantly. So in that respect, the drop is even more significant. In 1994, the FBI data shows that you had about 6 firearm murders per 100,000 people. And now in 2017, which is when this was put together, because we don't have some of the newest ones, it was half of that, 3 murders for 100,000 people. And again, whether it's 1, 2, 3 murders or whatever, any murder is certainly tragic. But the point is, and the point they're making is the reason people believe this is because there has been so much reporting on mass shootings. Which brings me to one other piece which we'll mention just before the break, and that is a piece that appeared just today, interestingly enough, on the Daily Signal, with the title, Guns Save These Americans from Assault and Robbery in July. And the argument being made there is that a lot of people are convinced that all these guns lead to the shootings, but the reality is some of those same firearms are used in self-defense. Let me quote from the Centers for Disease Control, hardly a biased source at all, noted in their report that almost all national studies of defensive gun uses have found that firearms are used in self-defense between 500,000 and 3 million. They're using some of these numbers, which I think are a little bit funny. But if you look at the John Lott numbers, which I think is actually very accurate, almost 3 million times during a year, handguns are displayed and prevent a murder or stop a murder or a robbery taking place. Those are facts that are important, especially in light of our debate. Let's take a break. We'll have a lot more to say right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
If you've ever listened to Dennis Prager's radio program, you know that he often talks about the difference between liberals and conservatives. And you would also know that he dedicates 1 hour to what he calls the happiness hour, where he explores why people are happy or unhappy. So it's not surprising that he recently wrote a commentary on the subject, Liberals and Conservatives Are Unhappy for Different Reasons. He says that unhappy conservatives generally believe they are unhappy because life is difficult or tragic or because they made some unwise decisions in life. Liberals are unhappy generally because they believe they have been persecuted. A left-wing woman may attribute her unhappiness to American society's patriarchy or misogyny. She therefore feels oppressed. He also argues that the more left-wing blacks will attribute his or her unhappiness to racism. He has noticed that black conservatives have a much happier disposition than left-wing blacks. He's also found that a cheerful black caller to his radio program is almost always a conservative. Near the end of his commentary, he gives a personal example. His father, an Orthodox Jew, wrote his college senior thesis on the subject of anti-Semitism in America. His father was well aware of bigotry in this country, but still reminded Dennis Prager and his brother that American Jews are the luckiest Jews in history because they're Americans. Prager says, "I therefore never knew what it was like to walk around thinking most of the people I met hated me. That alone contributed to my happiness." He correctly concludes that unhappy Americans on the right blame the problems inherent to life and blame themselves. Unhappy Americans on the left blame America. This simple formula explains so much. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, this is sort of turning out to be a Dennis Prager day, and the reason for that is his most recent column is one that I want to discuss next. Then I want to talk about a response that has come from the Columbia Journalism Review, which argues that there is no censorship by Google. And, of course, I will respond then to the piece that Dennis Prager put out more recently on that subject, and also a column I have coming out next week. And, of course, Dennis Prager is also mentioned today in my commentary, so he definitely gets a lot of PR today. But this is another good example of you are certainly welcome to your own opinions, but you're not welcome to your own facts. And Dennis Prager, in his piece that came out just a day or two ago, felt the need to really address this issue because, first of all, it was something that he wanted to address. And it also is part of the PragerU video that came out called the Charlottesville Lie. And he says one of the two greatest lies of our time, the other being that all Trump supporters are racist, and perhaps in all of history, he says, I can't think of a lie that's worse. And what he's talking about is the argument that's being made not only by people in the press and not only by the average American citizen who knows no different, but even by the former vice president, who you would have to believe knows that is different, in which they all make the statement that Donald Trump, back in Charlottesville, said that these Nazis and Ku Klux Klan men were fine people. Now, if you don't think this is an important issue, for those of you watching online, you can see that I've got a little file folder here, and the file folder says fine people, because I felt that it's always been important for me to have articles that respond to that, because this is one of the most pernicious lies that has been promoted, and it keeps getting repeated. It was used even by the former vice president's announcement that he was running for office. And so it's something that certainly is easily dismissed, but nevertheless is something that just simply carries on year after year now, and it is going to be run even into the campaign. But nevertheless, if you have not seen this, it's very clear. Dennis Prager says, by remarkable coincidence, this week's PragerU video is entitled The Charlottesville Lie, so you can watch it for yourself. Except I just found out that Google, who says that they never censor, just put the Charlottesville Lie on its restricted list, which means that the commentary just wrote the other day about, was it 56 56 videos actually being restricted. I guess that brings us up to 57. But nevertheless, the numbers get so high, it's almost not even worth mentioning anymore. But again, he says that this particular video proves that the president never said that Nazis were fine people. When Trump said that they were fine people on both sides, he was referring to people demonstrating in Charlottesville for and against tearing down the statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, not to Nazis and Antifa. And it's pretty obvious if you've listened to the video, because he even comes back at one point and makes it very clear. But in case you need a little more information, you can actually watch the video. It's presented by a CNN political commentator, Steve Cortes, a voice of courage, he says, in a herd known as the mainstream American media. At this point, Prager used 325 videos. Cortes, the Charlottesville lie is the one I most want Americans to watch. The harm that the media and others on the left have done and continue to do to this country is charging the president with praising Nazis and other white supremacists is incalculable. It has only served to inflame and divide Americans, the tens of millions who believe the lie and the tens of millions who know the truth. And so then he goes into some other examples that he has there. But if nothing else, before I finish this and move on to another one, Dennis Prager, I really appreciate him because he sometimes does what I'm trying to do more and more at Point of View. You don't have access to all this information. You don't have access to the videos and the audio and all that. But sometimes you just have to use, dare I use this phrase, common sense. And that is, he said, just think about this for a minute. Does this even make sense? Donald Trump has a Jewish daughter, a Jewish son-in-law, and Jewish grandchildren. Nazis want Jews dead. How do all the New York Times columnists, Dennis Prager says, CNN reporters and anchors, correspondents, and Democratic office holders who say the president called Nazi fine people and who believe the president is a white supremacist reconcile these two facts? Well, of course, they don't have to, because you just name call and you move on. But nevertheless, this is just another example of, as he said, probably tens of millions of people that believe that, and yet there is a need to provide an alternative. And certainly that PragerU video, even though it's now restricted, so that means if you're a child listening to this right now, you probably can't watch it, but almost anybody else listening on Point of View can watch it and come to your own conclusions based upon some of the audio and other statements that are there as well. Here's one that surfaced today, and I even sent it on to Dennis Prager. Not that I have a connection to Dennis Prager. I had to go through his website where you just put your name and everything. But this comes from the Columbia Journalism Review. I do receive the Columbia Journalism Review, and this is written by an individual that talks about the myth of social media anti-conservative bias refuses to die. And he says, in this particular case, there's almost a total lack of evidence to support the theory. It's something promoted by alt-right groups. Then when he starts mentioning who they are, one of them is like Diamond and Silk. No, they're not alt-right. I mean, these are African-American women that are making some crazy statements sometimes, but anyway. But the bottom line is he says that these groups, some of the conservatives, even the White House, continue to promote the idea that Facebook, Twitter, and Google are somehow biased against them. And then he says that there is a parade of grievances. And then very quickly, if you will, goes on to mention a few that have complained about it. And except for Diamond and Silk, which I know a little bit about, anybody else there, I'm like, who are these people? It would have been, I think, at least helpful if he had quoted Dennis Prager. If for no other reason, then I'm just a minute going to read from an editorial that was in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, or 2 days ago. Take that back, 2 days ago. And even if the writer couldn't include that, wouldn't you think that the Columbia Journalism Review would have put a little footnote at the end saying, now, even more recently, Dennis Prager in the Wall Street Journal has made this argument. But nevertheless, here it goes through and tries to explain what these are and some of the complaints. But again, most of these people are not even necessarily people I know that well. And, of course, those that are known well, like Donald Trump or Sean Hannity, it doesn't go into kind of, if you will, sort of a significant analysis of all of that. But again, you can believe the Columbia Journalism Review, or let's just take the piece that I quoted from yesterday and have coming out in a commentary next week about the number of individuals that have actually found their particular commentary on the PragerU video put in a restricted area. I mentioned 56 of those. Now, if you want to count the most recent, maybe 57. And these are very good people. I mean, former Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz is in that category. Churchill biographer Andrew Roberts. Ayan Hirsi Ali, a Somalian American, who's been speaking out on those issues as well. A couple of others. Heather McDonald's been on the program with the Manhattan Institute. Those are all put in a restricted category. You might say, well, they're not necessarily censored. Well, if you have any kind of parental controls on YouTube, you wouldn't even know they existed. And so that's certainly the first issue that you might see. But again, it isn't just Google and it isn't just YouTube. This researcher at Columbia University. Oh, wait a minute. Columbia University, Columbia Journalism Review. Could the two of these professors talk to each other? Possibly, because this professor actually undertook a study of Twitter political bias and concluded that of the 22 prominent political individuals who actually were suspended, isn't that interesting? 21 of the 22 supported Donald Trump. So, you can say till you're blue in the face that there is no bias, but after all, that is certainly hard to actually justify in light of phrase. This is a professor from Columbia University. Can we two people at Columbia talk to each other, just kind of figure that out? And of course, my favorite line of all of that is when asked why some of these videos were put under restriction in the last Senate hearing, which was chaired by Ted Cruz, the Google representative said, well, they put the 10 Commandments video in a restricted list because the video mentioned murder. And and he wasn't joking, by the way, but apparently Dennis Prager was, in which he assured the Senate committee that he'd be glad to release a Google-friendly video called The 9 Commandments. You cannot make this stuff up. I've got more. We're just getting started. We'll be back right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
I'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me give you again a program note. In about a half an hour, we'll be talking with Samuel Rodriguez, and he'll give us his analysis of what is happening at the border. And for people that say, well, he's a friend of the president, well, you know, he's been willing to be an advisor to anyone, and frankly, sometimes has been relatively critical of the president and those who are not dealing with our immigration system. But take it as you would. I wanted to give you a chance to hear from somebody who actually demanded that the Trump administration allow him and other pastors to go and see it for themselves. They also asked that we not fix anything. I want to see it the way it really was, so don't manipulate this. Matter of fact, when we talk with him, he'll talk about how, in some respects, even the conspiracy part of him wondered, did they just fix this up for us? Did they prevent us from seeing something? And he made a point of wanting to go see every one of the facilities, not just the few that they wanted to drag him through. So you get an opportunity to hear from him. Martin Mawyer is going to be dealing with a controversial issue, too, about the Muslim Community Patrol in New York City. That's all next hour. And then in the third hour, we got Michael Youssef, and then we'll get back to some more of those issues. I've talked about this idea that you are certainly welcome to your own opinions, but you're not welcome to your own facts. And this, I think, is also illustrated by the fact that sometimes the mainstream press won't cover some of the stories. As we'll talk about with Martin Mawyer, even if they had the same information he did, just think it through. Would it be possible for a reporter to interview enough of these individuals, since some of the Muslims that we will hear about did not want to have their names or their identity shown because they're afraid they might be killed, and it's not just an idle concern. But if indeed you get enough substantial evidence for that, then would your editor want that particular story to be run, fearing that then CAIR, which is the Council on Islamic Relations, would come after you, and on and on and on. And so sometimes these stories, as much as they should be covered, aren't. And here is a great illustration of this, and this comes from WorldNet Daily, who's actually just summarizing a conversation that happened on Rush Limbaugh's program, but then ties it into the New York Times. So stay with me for a minute, because it illustrates again why the mainstream media sometimes doesn't cover the stories. There was apparently one of the callers to Rush Limbaugh that said something like, everyone knows the Dayton shooter said he was anti-Trump. By the way, if you have any questions about that, I've got lots of evidence of it. Here, for example, this one that appeared in the Washington Times, and that's actually Cal Thomas's piece here. So a pro-Satan leftist hoped to vote for Elizabeth Warren, blamed corporations. You can go through the long list. But, you know, if you listen to this program even on Monday, I mentioned some of that. And I even had people afterwards saying, I didn't know that. The press never covered it. So anyway, here's the issue. This is what Rush Limbaugh said after this individual, I guess his name was Chris. And he says, folks, I can hear your reactions out there when Chris says everyone knows the Dayton shooter said that he was anti-Trump. No, everyone doesn't know it. The people watching mainstream media don't know it. They know an entirely different thing. And he puts "no" in quotes. They are being lied to about the Dayton shooter, and they're being lied to about the El Paso shooter, and they're being lied to about Trump each and every day. And he goes on and then talks about the drive-by media and makes a number of other statements. But then the point he makes is this. The people reading all of this think that nothing more than this is a propaganda sheet, and that's the role the New York Times plays. The same people who hate Fox News and want to shut down Fox News look at the New York Times identically. They don't look at it as a citadel of journalism. They don't read the New York Times to find out what's really going on with the truth. They read the New York Times because to them it's their daily propaganda affirmation. Now, those are pretty strong words from Rush Limbaugh. So let's get into it. He cited the recent scandal involving the New York Times. And if you're not familiar, let me hold this up. The New York Times the other day had a headline that simply said, Trump urges unity versus racism. You can find that edition if you look, although I think it's now been taken off the electronic edition. And what happened after that, here, let me just quote Rush Limbaugh, and then I'll read the story about it as well. When the Times strays like it did yesterday with that headline that did not condemn Trump as a white supremacist or racist, they flooded the place with claims and threats to cancel their subscriptions. So Rush says, well, what did the Times do? Well, the Times didn't stand up and say, well, he uses a word I wouldn't use, we are the deans of journalism. We're in charge of our product each and every day. We determine what's in our paper, not you. No, they didn't say that. They reached over, they grabbed the ankles, okay, I won't go down there, and basically changed the title. So you can actually find two titles for the New York Times. The first one, which caused so much apoplexy, so much conflict, and so many people calling in saying that they would cancel the subscription to the New York Times if they didn't change it. By the way, I do get the electronic version of the New York Times. I pay heavily for it, but nevertheless. But because the headline said Trump urges unity, there were people that were furious with that. And so within a few hours, then you had one that said assailing hate but not guns, which was a little bit. And so there is a good example of the kind of pressure that simply came from the subscribers. And back to something we'll talk about a little bit later with Martin Mawyer, you can see the kind of conflict and the kind of pressure that would be put on, say, the New York Times, if they were to take any time to really study the Muslim Community Patrol or send down reporters to the border, as we'll talk about in the first half hour, and report that actually this is pretty good. You can see that that just might not see the light of day. And so that's why, if nothing else, I really do encourage you to read widely. I mentioned Cal Thomas just a minute ago. He has a very good piece out as well. Mass murders are a symptom. And he says, one of the questions that no one is asking is, why is evil rampant in our country? He said, I don't mean obvious evil like the all too frequent mass murders. There are other evils that seem to come, as he said, from the pit that are roaming among us uncontrolled. We seem to tolerate everything these days and oppose controlling what once was called evil behavior. Bad behavior is now considered good, and good behavior is thought to be bad. Those who practice good behavior are often labeled with words that end in phobe, Islamophobe, homophobe, whatever, Societal norms have been undermined. Normal is what individuals think is true for them. So if you want to read the column, he spends a fair amount of time, first of all, starting all the way back to the 17th and 18th century with Jonathan Edwards' classic Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Then he takes us to the 19th century with one of those, if you will, kind of sermons by Abraham Lincoln that issued a proclamation for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. And he goes into some of that just to provide, if you will, kind of a scriptural and theological antidote. And his point is well taken. Certainly, this is a great evil, mass murders, but there are all sorts of other murders taking place right now that sometimes don't even get mentioned by the press and oftentimes get excused by people that don't really see a problem. Just before we take a break, though, some people say, what can we do? Well, another factor that I would add to the table is if you see something, say something. And we now know, since we're broadcasting just a few miles from Allen, Texas, that it turns out that the suspect in the shooting in El Paso, the mother of the suspect in Allen, called the Allen, Texas Police Department weeks before the shooting because she was concerned about her son owning an AK-type firearm. Turns out it was an AR-15, but, that's fine. And so this was actually confirmed to CNN. The mother contacted police because she was worried about her son owning the weapon, given his age, maturity level, and lack of experience handling a firearm. During the call, the mother was transferred to a public safety officer who told her that based on her description, her son, 21, was legally allowed to purchase the weapon. The mother did not provide her name or the son's name, and the police did not seek any additional information from her before the call concluded. And according to the family's attorneys, the mother's inquiry was more informational in nature, was not motivated out of a concern that her son posed a threat to anyone. As we have said on this program so many times, there are all many times when we say there were some warning signs, And it is difficult to figure out how, given our current set of laws, you could have even removed the gun from that individual, because she wasn't necessarily even surfacing a red flag. So even if we had these so-called red flag laws, might not have pulled that out of his hands, but you just never know. And I just thought I'd put that one on the table as we search for ways in which we can prevent mass shootings. I certainly think that some of the spiritual comments by Cal Thomas are appropriate, but even here, sometimes police officers might want to ask another question or two. Maybe they could have prevented something that has been such a horrific act. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Top of the hour, we are going to be talking with Samuel Rodriguez about what's happening in the border. Martin Mawyer will be talking about the Muslim Community Patrol. And then in the next hour, we'll be talking with Michael Youssef, Counting Stars in an Empty Sky. And then we'll get back to some other issues. And if I don't have time in this segment, we'll talk about Joaquin Castro putting out a hit list for anybody that has supported Donald Trump. Or maybe we'll get to it this segment, but we'll see. But one other article I wanted to kind of bring to the table is provocatively entitled White Boy Al-Qaeda. Now, you got to hang with me for a minute here. Kevin Williamson writes this, and he points out something I'd never known before, and that is that after 9/11, he said, he talked with a retired intelligence analyst, and a lot of people wondered why there wasn't sort of a follow-up attack. Matter of fact, that's what I expected. I remember the day after being on Point of View, because Marlon was out of town at the time, and saying, well, we don't know what's going to happen next, because I thought, if they attack on 9/11, they probably would attack on 9/12 too, and they did not. And the retired intelligence analyst said that what happened is that especially Al-Qaeda had the philosophy that each attack had to be greater than the next. And because the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Towers, the Pentagon, and everything was so great, they never really could come up with something greater. And, of course, by that time, then there was also a desire and actually a reality that President Bush sent in troops and disrupted them so much. So he said we never really did get that subsequent attack from Al-Qaeda, but he said we did get it from a lot of dysfunctional young white guys from suburbia. And that is, he says it is proper, he thinks, to actually declare the El Paso massacre as an act of terrorism. It was an act of political violence with a political point. It had a crackpot manifesto and all, so certainly that is the case. And, of course, there were some red flags we just talked about. But then he makes a statement, as far as we can tell, there really isn't much of a white boy Al-Qaeda, because the point he's making is it was a little easier to target some of these foreign terrorists, these domestic terrorists, harder to find. And that's where Jim Garrity, who quotes from him in a positive way, does say, I have a slight quibble with Kevin Williamson, because there is no white boy Al-Qaeda in the sense of having a bin Laden figure, a structure, an organization, funding networks, and all the rest. But we do have a situation like those lone wolf terrorist attacks where somebody is out there creating the message that inspires the desire to lash out through violence, and a variety of obscure, angry young men absorbing this message, believing it, and then reaching to a point where they act on it. So he says it's a lot closer to the Al-Qaeda propaganda that inspired the Boston Marathon bombers. Well said again, Jim Garrity. So this is something that needs to be addressed. And certainly, as I'll be reading some of the thoughts on the El Paso shooting, we can certainly say that Donald Trump has not helped this. But from the very beginning, I've always said that whether people were inspired by something that Bernie Sanders said, by Elizabeth Warren, by Donald Trump, by some other individual, people are still responsible for their actions. But it would be good if we could tamp down the rhetoric on both sides and begin to deal with these issues in a way that had some common sense. But Michael Tanner came up with 6 points, which I'll mention real quickly here, on some thoughts on the El Paso shooting. And his first point is we should never forget that the purpose of terrorism is to terrorize. To the degree we succumb to fear that we alter our lives or give up our freedoms, the terrorists win. And so he is certainly acknowledging, as more and more people are, that what happened in El Paso sort of is terrorism. And I had somebody the other day that was saying, I never really, when I get to church, ever thought about what would happen if somebody were to come into this church shooting. I guess because I'm a deacon and because we've done interviews on church shooting, I've thought about many times, even sometimes just tend to look around, make sure nobody's making any kind of sudden moves. But, after this, people start beginning to change their behavior. How many people now walking into a Walmart are going to say, I wonder if this is today? How many people, even though you're not supposed to be carrying a concealed weapon, do so when they walk into Walmart anyway? And you can begin to see the impact. Number 2, he says, in wake of 9/11, we allowed fear to lead us into a host of measures that threatened our civil liberties. I remember many times doing commentaries on the Patriot Act and even some of the things that have curtailed our freedom. Of course, there have been calls to regulate the internet, to ban video games, to curtail free speech. We've got to really think about some of those issues from a common sense point of view. Number 3, none of this is to diminish the threat nor the noxiousness of white supremacy, nor is it a call for interaction. Certainly there are things that government can and should do, and it's long past time to take violence from white supremacists as seriously as we do the threat from Islamic extremists. So I would agree with that. Number 4, a thoughtful decision needs to be based on data, not emotion. And really, if you've been listening to this program today, or even the one yesterday, where I tried to clear up some of the misinformation, today about the murder rate, yesterday about whether or not an AR-15 is something that could be used by a homeowner to protect themselves. Those are very important issues we've talked about before. Number 5, he says, perhaps the most important thing we can do is not involve the government. For instance, we can police our own speech and behavior. We can all be more civil with one another. Political disagreements are not treason. It's not political correctness to avoid personal insults or to show sensitivity, especially when discussing issues such as race, which leads, of course, to the 6th and final point. And yes, this is particularly important for our political leaders. President Trump is not responsible for the actions of the El Paso gunman, but it is clear that the president's rhetoric has contributed to this toxic stew in which the gunman's sick beliefs festered. So I thought some really great points by Michael Tanner, and I would certainly recommend that if you want to read those, you can as well. Let me just, before we take a break, mention that my commentary today is another quote from Dennis Prager. Didn't intend this, but he's getting a lot of airtime today, but this one is entitled Unhappy for Different Reasons. The point I make is if you've ever listened to Dennis Prager's radio program, and maybe you have listened to it instead of listening to this program, which is certainly fine because he's got a lot of great things to say, he even has what is called the Happiness Hour. And so if anybody's kind of thought about what it means to be happy or unhappy, it's certainly a man that has dedicated at least an hour a week, if not more, to the whole question of happiness. And he has concluded that people that are conservatives who are unhappy generally are unhappy because life is difficult or tragic because they have made some unwise decisions. But he's found that liberals are unhappy generally because they believe they've been persecuted. And he points out, as one left-wing woman that he was quoting here was attributing her unhappiness to patriarchy or misogyny. Others attribute it to racism or bias or victimology or something like that. And the example he uses is he says, I grew up Jewish. My father, an Orthodox Jew, wrote his college thesis on the subject of anti-Semitism in America. Of course, I know that Dennis Prager has spoken on and written on that as well. But nevertheless, even though his father wrote his a very important thesis, college senior thesis on anti-Semitism, he said that his father always reminded them that they were the luckiest Jewish people in history and the luckiest Jewish people in the world, because he said, I never knew what it was like to walk around thinking that most of the people hated me, and this contributed to my happiness. So if nothing else, just a reminder that sometimes you're responsible for your own happiness. And the most recent Dennis Prager one actually is Jordan Peterson saying, you can't change other people, but you can change yourself. And maybe that's the lesson we need to learn there as well. Jordan Peterson's not even a Christian, but that's a Christian idea. I thought I'd pass it on to you. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we'll do so right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to be spending some time in this first half here talking about the border crisis, immigration, and some of the observations from Samuel Rodriguez, who is an individual who's been on this program with us before and is the president of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, an individual that was actually the first Hispanic evangelical pastor to offer prayer at the presidential inauguration, picked a number of years ago by Time magazine as one of 100 of the most influential people in the world, an individual that has a master's degree from Lehigh University and a number of honorary doctorates, as well as author of a number of books we've talked about with him on the program, The Lamb's Agenda, the bestseller Be Light, and joins us now by phone. Samuel Rodriguez, thank you for joining us here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me.
I might just mention also senior pastor of the New Season Church there in Sacramento, California. And one of the things that you put together were an opportunity for you and a group of other pastors to actually go and look at what is happening at the border. Now, you know as well as I do that we've heard stories about women losing their hair, not having a shower for more than a week, drinking out of toilets, being put behind cages, and on and on. So we've posted a very good article from Christian Post where you were interviewed about that trip. But tell us how this came together, the pastors, and what kind of access you had at these border facilities.
Of course. I was troubled. The images that I saw on television, on different news outlets, and what I heard, of course, anecdotally from various sources not connected to me, but external sources, I went, whoa. If this is true, this is without a doubt a crisis. So I made a call to the White House. And via the conduit of that call, I was granted unbridled access. In 24 hours, I received a response, which was, Pastor Sam, go. They're waiting for you, and unbridled access. So I arrived. I invited a number of my friends. All these pastors are significant leaders in their communities, and they pastor multi-ethnic churches. So we traveled together. We arrived at these places with no agenda whatsoever, with no agenda except finding the truth, exposing truth. So there we go. We went to the controversial Clint Station Detention Center, where all the reports emerged out of the initial reports. This is the Clint Station Detention Center, where the attorneys that were interviewed in that famous article talked about soiled diapers. This is that center, right? So we arrived. I kid you not, what I discovered was completely the opposite. And I mean the opposite. I found Border Patrol agents, customs agents, primarily of Latino Hispanic descent, by the way, which was pretty ironic. I found them very caring, compassionate. I went through every single sector of that center. I saw the kids. I saw them. And what I saw was an environment, a very difficult environment, of course, but an environment where everyone was created in the image of God. Everyone was trying their best to make a very difficult circumstance better. I did not find soiled diapers, quite the opposite. I found everything pristine. I found Dorito potato chips, Frito-Lay. I found cookies and drinks and beverages and water, sports activities. That's what I discovered. So I was intrigued. I went sidebar. I went offline. And I said, hey, gentlemen, in full disclosure, I just need to ask a question. Is this a setup? Did you fix the scenario after the article came out. Did you stage this for yours truly? And the irony of this entire circumstance is that many of these individuals actually attend our churches. So we actually connected because, I know that, Pastor. Hey, Pastor Sam, I attend one of your churches here. So many of them are good, God-fearing Christians. So I asked them, hey, gentlemen, was this staged? Absolutely not, Pastor Sam. This is the identical situation, circumstance, and condition that the attorneys witnessed when they came in here. So why did the attorneys give a different story? Pastor Sam, they never toured the center. What do you mean they never toured the center? No, they came to a conference room and interviewed kids from the ages of 2 to 17. Wait a minute, they interviewed a 2-year-old kid? Yes, that's where the soiled diaper narrative came out of. Are you kidding me? No. Why isn't this in the news? We don't know, Pastor Sam, but they never, ever toured the facility. That's what prompted me to have a press conference and say, let the truth be told. And again, I didn't go there with any other agenda but to expose truth and find out what's truly going on. And what I found out was we have an amazing group of men and women committed to, hey, how about this? They were bringing from their personal collections from their kids, children's DVDs and animated programming for these kids to see at the center. So they would bring their Disney DVDs over to the center from their kids. And so what I saw was compassion. Parents who have kids at home broken for the situation regarding these kids in the centers. What I found was a group of men and women trying to make a very difficult circumstance better for all involved.
If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Samuel Rodriguez will only be with us for about a half an hour because we're going to move on to another topic at the bottom of the hour. So I wanted to give any of you who had comments or questions a chance to join us. One of the other things that we've heard more than once in various news reports is that the detainees were forced to sleep on cement floors. And I've even seen some of these pictures that oftentimes are shown. What did you find?
No, I found there was sufficient bedding and cots for absolutely everyone. Now, and I mean sufficient. And now I need to be very transparent here. On certain circumstances, the agents were very, very forthright in sharing the fact that when they were overwhelmed, they were not expecting the amount of people attempting to come in over the border illegally. When they were overwhelmed, the situation became precarious, that the spacing, of course, was limited. So they brought in sheets, they brought in cots, and they worked more with cots and try to help and accommodate so individuals wouldn't be sleeping on cement floors. Again, the situation is not utopia. It's difficult, especially when the numbers increase egregiously overnight at the border. But what I saw when I was there was enough bedding for absolutely everyone.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to give a few of you a chance if you want to ask a question or make a comment. That number is 1-800-351-1212. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to see some of this in print, we have this one article from Christian Post, which has a significant interview with Samuel Rodriguez. It also has some of the comments by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, some of the other statements being made by a variety of other individuals, and then I think a very significant section that has footnotes so that you can find the original quotes, comments, and articles there as well. In addition to that, if you go to our website, pointofview.net, and click on the picture there of Samuel Rodriguez, that will take you to this organization that he is part of, which again is the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, or you can go to nhclc.org, don't matter there. And so that is an opportunity for you to read some of that. And also there is information about the book that we've talked about with him before, You Are Next. And so if you're not familiar with his book and some of his earlier books, that's all available as well. But let's take a break. And if you have a comment or a question, let me give you that opportunity, because then at the bottom of the hour, we're going to move on to some other topics. Just wanted to get an on-the-scene report from an individual that toured those facilities, and we'll come back with Samuel Rodriguez right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
If you've ever listened to Dennis Prager's radio program, you know that he often talks about the difference between liberals and conservatives. And you would also know that he dedicates 1 hour to what he calls the happiness hour, where he explores why people are happy or unhappy. So it's not surprising that he recently wrote a commentary on the subject, Liberals and Conservatives Are Unhappy for Different Reasons. He says that unhappy conservatives generally believe they are unhappy because life is difficult or tragic or because they made some unwise decisions in life. Liberals are unhappy generally because they believe they have been persecuted. A left-wing woman may attribute her unhappiness to American society's patriarchy or misogyny. She therefore feels oppressed. He also argues that the more left-wing blacks will attribute his or her unhappiness to racism. He has noticed that black conservatives have a much happier disposition than left-wing blacks. He's also found that a cheerful black caller to his radio program is almost always a conservative. Near the end of his commentary, he gives a personal example. His father, an Orthodox Jew, wrote his college senior thesis on the subject of anti-Semitism in America. His father was well aware of bigotry in this country, but still reminded Dennis Prager and his brother that American Jews are the luckiest Jews in history because they're Americans. Prager says, "I therefore never knew what it was like to walk around thinking most of the people I met hated me. That alone contributed to my happiness." He correctly concludes that unhappy Americans on the right blame the problems inherent to life and blame themselves. Unhappy Americans on the left blame America. This simple formula explains so much. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Pastor Samuel Rodriguez, again, president of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, also senior pastor at New Season Church in Sacramento, California. And Samuel Rodriguez, let's, if we can, talk about what we can do. In this article, it first of all talks about what Abby Johnson, a pro-life leader, has done. She's been on the program before. She's kind of the inspiration for the movie Unplanned, and so that was one thing I wanted to get to in just a minute. But let's start with what the churches can do, because I know my own church, Jack Graham is the pastor, and he, as well as the Spanish pastor, have been down at the border and wanted to do some things. I know that through the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, you've also wanted to relaunch your For His Children campaign, and in partnership with, I guess, with Convoy of Hope, you want to provide humanitarian needs. So talk about what you're doing and what listeners and churches listening right now could do in terms of addressing the border crisis.
Indeed. Number one, prayer. And I know recently there's been an undermining of the ability of prayer and the deliverable, the results of prayer. Shake that off. Prayer works. Praying in Jesus' name actually works. So, yeah, prayer. Let's begin by prayer. Second is, how can we come together and address the needs? Again, these children are innocent. They really are. We don't want anyone coming here illegally, but these children are, to a great degree, not responsible for the decisions made by their parents and those pushing them over, taking them over, sending them over. So what do we do as a church? We have to demonstrate compassion. And how do we do that? Well, we have to address their humanitarian needs. These children, many of them come over, and I do mean this, Kerby, they come over shoeless. And I do mean without any shoes. There's no hyperbole there. They come in malnourished. They come in very difficult circumstances, in very precarious health conditions. So I've partnered with Convoy of Hope, the NACLC. We've come together with Convoy of Hope to provide simple hygiene products when they come over the border and they're detained and the detention centers. If they don't have the sufficient supplies, we come alongside, and we're working right now. We are attempting to formalize a relationship with our federal government, especially when the numbers are egregious and the federal government does not have the necessary resources. We want to come alongside and provide the necessary resources for these kids to have the basic necessities in order to survive as the process goes along in what we call the bureaucracy of government and immigration right now, which is a complicated system where they allocate them, connect them to families, and if they can't connect them to family members, subsequently foster families. We want to be there along for the journey, and we want to be able to minister to these kids and demonstrate the compassion and the love of Christ.
Well, again, I know that you've been trying to work so that you could provide foster homes for some of these detained children.
Yes.
And so that's another action item, I think, for some of these churches, isn't it?
Yeah, I would love, and Jack Graham, of course, is a dear friend of mine, but I would love to see as many churches do what Prestonwood does, what other churches do, Ronnie Floyd, other churches out there who have truly emerged and said, look, we're just not going to complain about things. We're going to do things. And if we can get our members to say, hey, I'm going to open up my home. I'm going to open up my home. I'm available. That's the sort of what the term would be prophetic advocacy, where we are turning on the light in the midst of darkness. A Christian home opening up to a child that came over the border, demonstrating the love of Christ while the government takes care of the paperwork, right? But that time in that foster home where they're hearing about Christ and faith and mercy and grace and truth, that may very well be the most important moment that can change eternity for that individual. So please, if you're listening, please volunteer. There is a way to do this. Please volunteer. There are different websites you can go to. Go to the NACLC.org website. We have more information there. Contact Convoy of Hope. And let's work together to bring a solution to this very complex issue.
It does seem to me, too, that if you are literate in Spanish, this would be a great opportunity for ministry, even if you're at the border. And even if you're not, one of the arguments that I remember seeing in, I think it was the New York Times, is that these kids were caged up all day. But what I'm hearing is there's opportunities for them to go out there and play soccer and do a variety of other things. So even if you're not good at Spanish and you are good at soccer, there are some things that you could do. True?
Yeah, there are opportunities for you to go to these centers, for you to serve, for you to help. Absolutely. And they're not caged up all day. Even the idea of the cages, again, it goes back to the Obama administration. But no, I mean, I was there. And they have time for recreation. They had soccer balls. They had different athletic equipment available where I was there at the Clinton Station. So, no, that's just hyperbole. It really is hyperbole.
I know. One more action item before we get into some other things that I want to mention with the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference. There, in the article that we have here, Abby Johnson is mentioned. Of course, she was the inspiration for the movie Unplanned, but she headed down there with an 18-wheeler of supplies, primarily diapers. And I just might want to call out some of our pregnancy resource centers here and say, not only can you have a ministry in your own community for those, but also you can have a ministry there at some of these border stations. So that's another point of action. And for people that say, well, I got to read this for myself, one of the things, Samuel, I've done is posted this article. It actually takes about 7 pages if you want to print it out. But it's got 40 endnotes. So if people say, wait a minute, I want to read this for myself. I want to see what was said, for example, by the New York Times, or what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says, or I want to see some of the quotes from Samuel Rodriguez, because I want to pass this on to people that are convinced that we are actually caging children and forcing them to drink out of toilets and everything. I wanted people to have access to that article. But also, just before we run out of time, let's talk about what's available on your website for that in regard, because, again, it is nhclc.org. People don't have to remember all that because we have it on our website. But talk about what's on your website, because if they want to begin to counter some of the false narratives, give us some information about how to do so.
Yeah, indeed. We launched a campaign called For His Children, and his meaning God's children. It's in partnership with Convoy of Hope. go to our website. There is a link there, and there's more information there directly to Convoy of Hope, our lead partner in providing the resourcing to these kids. And again, it's a beautiful, very biblically substantiated, Christ-centered campaign to help out these children at the border. And it likewise provides portals for you to engage. If you want to sign up, if you actually want to go physically to one of these centers and volunteer, there are different avenues by which, of course, there has to be a vetting process. You have to acquire permission. The government has to approve it. But we have some entries, and we have leadership there in the region, and we'll do our best to try to get you in there, all things being equal, for you to minister and help and serve and just bring hope to these children who are likewise suffering indeed.
And again, it is the number 4, his children. But again, all you have to really do is either make your way to pointofview.net or the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference. And Samuel Rodriguez, I know you are a busy pastor. The last thing you need to do is head to the border, but I'm glad that you did. And I'm glad that you've been kind of our eyes and ears here at Point of View. And if you learn more information or want to motivate our listeners to do something else, I hope you'll be in contact with us. And I really appreciate the time that you gave us today here on Point of View.
Will do. Thank you for having me.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to change topics. But let me just very quickly mention that this resource, it comes from Christian Post, and of course you can probably find some others, but I thought this was very helpful. If you wanted to find like one article, you maybe of having a point, counterpoint, maybe some of the arguments saying, well, look at all the horrific things happening at the border. I thought it was helpful that Samuel Rodriguez and these other pastors were able to go down there. He does raise the question in the article here that, even my conspiracy mindset kicked in for a minute. Was this all staged? And so that's when he was asking some really tough questions. You can read the article and see that there was not one area of the facility that they could not access. And so as a result, this gave him a sense of what was happening there as well. It has also not only his quotes, but quotes from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, quotes from the New York Times, quotes from some of these lawyers and others and what they did. And then it also has a whole section on what people like Abby Johnson did of bringing diapers down there and all the things that Samuel Rodriguez and his group at the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference were doing and how they're partnering with Convoy of Hope. So if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to just counter some of the things I've seen on Facebook or Twitter, this would be a very good piece to link. If you'd just like to say, this is maybe something our church should get involved with in one way or another, I hope that you'll take this article and use it. And if anybody challenges you on any of the statements you make, like I said, there's 40 endnotes at the end, which allow you then to have some of the documentation for what we have been talking about here today. Well, we're going to move from one controversial issue to another. That is the secret agenda of New York City's Muslim patrol cars. This comes from our friends at the Christian Action Network. Martin Mawyer will be with us, and we're going to be talking about what's happening in New York with these Muslim patrols right after these important messages.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our teams stand strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Now we're going to spend some time talking about these Muslim patrol cars in New York City and elsewhere, and they may be actually things that would show up in your own community, so we wanted you to know about that. Martin Mawyer is with us, and he has been on the program with us many times before, a freelance journalist. Many of you that are a little bit older might remember he was the editor-in-chief of Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority Report. Back in 1990, founded what is called the Christian Action Network. He's been on the program with us many times before. He's written 4 books, 3 documentary films, including a more recent book that we've talked about on this program, Twilight in America, The Untold Story of Islamic Terrorist Training Camps Inside America. Martin, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks for having me again, Kerby.
I might just mention that this special report that we're going to be talking about is available on our website, pointofview.net. And I might just also encourage you to take the time to put a little bit of extra paper in your printer if you're going to want to print this out, because it's pretty extensive. And just before we get into that one, let me just mention your earlier book and also the earlier interviews that we've done with you and even with Ryan on these terrorist training camps. What I found is oftentimes you're sort of on the cutting edge, and when you bring out a report like the one on the terrorist camps, what you have are people saying, nah, you're just overreacting, or yeah, there's just this one place, but it's not any big deal. And then over time, sometimes it's 6 months, sometimes it's a year later, then all of a sudden the mainstream media says, oh my gosh, we have some of these training camps in America. And you're going, yeah, we talked about that on Point of View a year ago. So right now, the issue we're talking about is somewhat controversial. If you go to Snopes.com, they'll say this isn't true. But I've been down this road with you before. Sometimes the mainstream media and others dismiss a story and then later on end up being quite willing to acknowledge, maybe internally, that there are some truthful factors, but they won't admit it to people like you. Is that a fair assessment of what's been happening in your life these days?
Well, that's an exact assessment, Kerby. I appreciate you pointing that out. Look, the mainstream media is not going to report on issues that are of great concern, I think, to the Christian community any longer. You know, they learned their lesson back in the 80s when I was with Dr. Jerry Falwell, that if you give too much attention to people on their so-called Christian right, it starts to make sense to the public. And if it starts to make sense to the public, politicians start to lose their races. So I think it's so interesting now because back in the 80s and the late 70s, a lot of Christian leaders were being interviewed constantly on television. You don't see that anymore. And the reason why is because they don't want to give them a public forum to convince the American people about what's really going on in America. So they basically have blacklisted groups like me and our organization and other religious leaders out there who are speaking about very important topics nowadays because they don't want the Americans to know the truth. When we came out with the book Twilight in America and disclosed all these terrorist camps in the United States, of course, they didn't want to give any attention to it. But the fact is, they did exist, and as you said, well, it took more than 6 months and more than a year before the media finally
I was being generous. Yeah, it took a while, but, even NBC eventually said, I think there's something to this. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then, now it's news all over the place, and I think, we're very happy with the job we did in exposing these camps, but it does take a long time for information that we put out there, especially our research undercover operations that we do, to finally hit the mainstream. But what really helps, though, is that people, your listeners, and people around the country who are concerned about these issues, talking about it and sharing it with their friends, because once that happens, then the mainstream media has little choice anymore but to give some attention to it. And I think that is the one goal that we have in putting out a report on these Muslim community patrol cars.
Sure.
So little attention. Now, it has had some attention internationally and in the United States, but basically so little attention is being given to what the purpose of these cars are really all about. And we wanted to put that report together. It took us a long time and a lot of work, and we had some paid undercover informants inside that community to be able to cull all this information and make that report happen. We're happy with the report. I think it's going to do what we expect it to do, and that is bring the criticism and the skepticism about what ultimately these cars are really up to.
And again, I might just mention this is a 16-page report, and if you find yourself saying, well, I want some documentation, there's 34 endnotes at the end. And the first thing is if you have not seen some of these reports, and I would imagine most of our listeners that live in different parts of the country have not, if you look at a Muslim patrol car and compare it to a New York Police Department patrol car, they look almost identical. If you look at the patrol patch of the Muslim Community Patrol and look at how that almost looks like the New York Police Department patrol patch, they look a lot like these patrol officers, but they're not patrol officers, are they?
No, but their intention is to be deceptive and to make people think they are a branch or division of the NYPD. That's why both have white Ford Tauruses. Both have the same colored decals on the car in the exact same spot. That's why they have the patch on the arms that has the exact same symbol as the NYPD patch. And if you look at the back page of the report, I really encourage your listeners to go to your website and take a look at this and download it. You'll see on the back page that there is a Muslim Community Patrol officer standing next to his car outside of the NYPD 72nd Precinct. Now, if you was to look at that picture, you would immediately think that they must be a part of the NYPD, and that's exactly why they had that photo taken there, is to confuse people into thinking they are a part of the NYPD. That's what that whole thing is about. And it's going to be very effective, I think, and their ultimate goal of intimidating people.
Well, the other goal, let's talk about this, because this is where the controversy sometimes surfaces, and that is that they want to enforce Sharia law. Now, for people that have listened to this program or have my booklet on Sharia law, we've talked about this with a variety of different individuals, Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy and others, that we shouldn't be surprised that in some of the courts, they've wanted to, at least in the civil courts or the family courts, maybe not criminal courts, wanted to bring Sharia law. If we look at what's happened in Europe, that shouldn't be surprising. But that's kind of the controversial aspect of this report. But you've spent some time, as you mentioned, and we have pictures of the interviews that you and Ryan have done with some of these undercover informants who are saying that very thing. Fill us in.
Yeah, so what we did is we had one of our informants go and try to apply for a job as an NCP officer. And he asked the question to the director of operations, do we plan on enforcing Sharia law? And the answer from Ashraf Fasma was, of course. We plan on enforcing Sharia law on the Muslims first and then on the non-Muslims, but we will also be enforcing the law of the land, meaning American law. And she pointed out that it would be hypocritical to only enforce the Sharia without also enforcing American law. So that is their goal, is to enforce Sharia law. Now, that should not be a real surprise if you know who the puppeteer is behind these cars. And his name is Imam Siraj Wahaj. Now, he's a well-known, he's well-known throughout the world as being America's Imam. He has a rather well-known mosque in Brooklyn called the Masjid Taqwa. He has many terrorist links. Back in the late 80s and in the early 90s, he had his own Sharia patrol force running around the Brooklyn area at that time. They didn't have cars, they didn't have uniforms, but they were carrying guns and they were carrying clubs. And even back then, the NYPD said they don't see the difference between his Sharia patrol force out there trying to stop people from selling drugs with guns and bullets than the drug people who were using drugs, guns and bullets to keep their operations going. So they have a tendency to, back then, a very strong tendency to be very violent. And I would expect you can see more of that in the future as these cars become more and more prevalent on the streets of New York City.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. If you have a comment or a question for Martin Mawyer, again, the number is 800-351-1212. If you do not know who Siraj Wahhaj is, some of that is in my book, Understanding Islam and Terrorism. And, of course, if you want to understand more about Sharia law, we always, of course, have the Sharia law booklets, one of the first ones we produce. So those are certainly available. But one of the things I wanted to make available, and I'll hold it up right now for those of you that are looking online, is this special report, 16 pages long, more than 30 different endnotes, lots of pictures that illustrate what we are talking about, and it's available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We have a few more minutes, Martin Mawyer with us as we talk about this particular special report, which is available to you on the Muslim patrol car. So that's something to consider as well. Just before I take some phone calls, Siraj Wahhaj has been in the news for some time. I know that after 9/11, there was really a desire on the part of President Bush to try to reach out to the Muslim community, so he had some visibility. But then there have been all sorts of questions about his involvement in some of these terrorist actions. Of course, you also have the loss of life of the grandson and some of these others. You spend some time documenting this because it's a good example of where if you aren't paying attention, and some of these names, for example, aren't ones that are top of the mind, you don't kind of know the connection points. But, Martin, one of the things you do is you connect a lot of points of different stories and pull them together in this special report, don't you?
Yeah, so it's interesting because people around the country have heard about the raid that took place on the terrorist camp that was disclosed in New Mexico last August. And the individual running that camp, his name was Siraj Wahaj as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he happens to be the son of the Siraj Wahaj that is running these Muslim community patrol cars in New York City. Also, two of his daughters were running that camp. So you have a man, Siraj Wahaj Sr., I'll call him, who once said that he predicts that the United States will crumble and will be replaced by a caliphate. He has called America a terrorist country. Now, he has a son and two daughters running a terrorist camp in New Mexico. Those individuals last May were finally charged with federal terrorism charges with a conspiracy to bring destruction on the United States that the federal prosecutors said was imminent. So if this is the type of children he's raising, and these are the type of statements that he's making that's causing children to buy ground to put a terrorist camp on, what do you think his ultimate plans might be for these Muslim community patrol cars running around in the city of New York?
Well, let's, if we can, give some of you a chance to join our conversation. So we'll head to Indiana first. Larry, thank you for calling today.
Thank you for taking my call. I have, I think you'd be touched on it just briefly, but I have three specific questions. Is this organization in New York City, since how their patrols representing a legal authority, are they then sanctioned by the city of New York? Two, what court in the United States then would enforce any violations that they may cite people with or have an arrest authority under? And if this is not, has it been reported to the U.S. Justice System and or otherwise the U.S. Attorney General?
Very good questions. Let me just mention, by the way, that one of the things I have in my Sharia law book is from a book that came out many years ago by our friends at the Center for Security Policy, which was entitled Sharia Law in the American State Courts. And they already documented, and this is 4 years old, so I would love to see if they could update this, but back then they had 50 significant cases in which courts in one way or another use Sharia law, not in the criminal courts, but in some of these others. So this isn't something that is hypothetical. It's pretty realistic. But what about this? Because we do recognize in some cities around the country that individuals hire patrols or various kinds of people to protect their businesses because they can't necessarily always expect the police to protect their business. But what's the connection between the Muslim patrol cars and the state of New York or the city of New York City, and what kind of jurisdiction would they actually have?
Well, when the cars first came out, Kerby, they said that the point of them was to be a liaison between the Muslim community and the NYPD because they knew how to speak Muslim lingo. Now, that's their word, not mine.
Right.
But then after the Christchurch attack in New Zealand early this year, where 50 Muslims unfortunately died, they changed their strategy and said that they're now providing security for the mosques of New York City and the Muslims of New York City. Actually, they call themselves security on steroids. But to be a security firm in the city of New York and the state of New York, you have to be licensed.
Right.
And they are not. In order to be licensed, you have to have an FBI background check. You got to be fingerprinted. And that's not something they're going to want to do, considering the type of people they have running these cars.
Yeah. So, again, some of it's sort of outside the law, which kind of gets us to our next caller. So let's take that one as well. We'll go to South Carolina, WLPE. Alice, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, that was my question, too, that they are breaking the law. And I can't believe, NYPD, the New York, would allow that.
Well, at first the NYPD came out and said very clearly, these Muslim community patrol cars are not a division of the NYPD. But once again, after the Christchurch attack in New Zealand, now they're coming out and saying, we recognize that these security cars can help provide safety for the Muslims of the city. So at one point, They held them off at hand's distance, and now they have open arms embracing them. As a matter of fact, the New York City police precinct in the 72nd Division is now helping train these officers in both self-defense techniques and suspect training techniques. So that looks like some of them are actually joining arms with the MCT officers.
You know, and just for a minute before we let you go, one of the things I've noticed in writing this particular book that I have on Islam and terrorism is that when you watch how it unfolds in other countries, when Muslims are a minority, oftentimes the argument is we just want to be protected from persecution. And I recognize that some Muslims have indeed been persecuted, and we do not agree with that whatsoever. But as they gain a higher percentage in a particular country, sometimes then they just sort of are able to cordon off those sections. And if you say, well, I can't believe that, travel with me to places in the UK, travel with me to places in France, and you will see some of these no-go zones. So there is a sense in which, as time goes on, this issue of whether or not they can create a separate system has sort of manifested itself in other countries. It hasn't really developed too much here in the United States, but that's one of the reasons why we wanted to make this special report available. So just before we let you go, Martin, how can people use this report? Because it seems to me that I'd like to put this 16-page report in anybody's hands. I'd like them to, if they want and really are skeptical, to read the 34 different endnotes. But at the same time, recognize that if you hand it to one of your friends and look it up on Snopes.com, they're going to say, well, that's not true. But I think you've done enough investigative reports and enough interviews to suggest that it is. But how can people use it?
And again, that's why we have 34 endnotes in it, so that people cannot say it's not true. Look, the 16 pages, as you mentioned, so it's obviously very expensive to print and to mail. So that's why we put it up on our website. You have it up on your website. And what I really encourage people to do to help us is to hit the share button. Look at it and share it with your friends, because it even has a greater impact if the report is coming from people they know than strangers such as myself. And that's how we were able to finally expose and get the word out about these terrorist camps, is that we encourage people to share the information with their friends. Once that happens, then public officials have to start taking notice of it. They have to look at what's in our film or in our book or in our reports and begin to learn whether or not this stuff is true. And they are going to find that it is true, and then they'll take action.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to the next opportunity, maybe when the mainstream press starts covering this, and then I'll have you on and saying, okay, you can say it. I told you so. But nevertheless, it's always been great to work with you, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Kerby, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, Michael Youssef will be with us as we talk about his new book. All that coming up right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to be talking with our good friend Michael Youssef in just a minute, but let me just also give you a preview that after we chat with him for a while about his book that is coming out next month, Counting Stars in an Empty Sky, we will also focus on a couple of erroneous things being said in the media right now. Actually, that would take more than a half an hour, but we'll just give it a half an hour to deal with some of these factual errors. As we have heard Daniel Patrick Moynihan say, we are certainly entitled to our own opinions. We're not entitled to our own facts, and we'll do a little bit of fact-checking and get into that a little bit later. But we are privileged to have for a few minutes Michael Youssef, who is the founder and president of Leading the Way, individual that has been on our program many times before, also the founding pastor of the Church of the Apostles, author of a number of books like The Life-Changing Prayers, which we talked about with him last time. This one, published by Baker, it will be out in the first part of September, Counting Stars in an Empty Sky, Trusting God's Promises for Your Impossibilities. Pastor Michael Youssef, always great to have you on the program with us.
Dr. Kerby, what a delight to be back with you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, 3,000 promises for Christians in the Bible. But in the limited time we have, we're going to focus on the 7 promises to Abraham, because I think that, first of all, helps us understand some of the conflict in the Middle East and really helps us understand how to apply some of those promises that God makes in the Bible to our own lives. So, again, talk about the genesis of this. I know it's probably something you've been preaching through, and we are going to have a chance to really spend some time looking at this book today.
I am, and what is the burden behind my dealing with issues like this and trying to preach? We live in such a materialistic society now that we really have forgotten what it is to live in the supernatural, and that we have a supernatural God. That we have become, even in the church, I'm talking about believers, and I'm not talking about people outside, of course they wouldn't know, but I'm talking about believers, that we have become so living in the natural, we have forgotten that we have a supernatural God, and that the very covenant that God made with Abraham, of course, was ultimately fulfilled in Christ, because Paul makes the argument both in Romans and Galatians that it was not seeds in the plural, but a seed, meaning Christ. Christ is the fulfillment of all the promises he made to Abraham. And therefore we, by our relationship with Christ, became truly the descendants of Abraham, that we are the children of faith, of the faith of Abraham. And so in the book, that's why I chose this provocative title, Start Counting Stars, but you can't see any. When you think Abraham was start counting stars, and it took him 25 years to see the very first one, that is something we, in our fast, materialistic, instant gratification society, just do not know. We can't even stay in prayer 25 minutes. Let alone 25 years.
That's right.
And so I'm really challenging the Christian community as we're becoming more and more of a remnant. I really believe that the remnants that was in the day of Isaiah that survived for those 700 years, and those are the faithful people like Simeon and, of course, John the Baptist and so on, they're the ones who are waiting for the Messiah, that that Isaiah was prophesying about 700 years early. We are now that remnant in Christendom. We're becoming such a small remnant, and I want that remnant to begin to feel and live and practice and pray and trust and exercise faith that is supernatural in the supernatural God.
Again, the book is coming out, and if you would like to pre-order it, it's available in paperback and Kindle, published by Baker, or be looking for it in your local bookstore. But let's, if we can, talk about this sevenfold promise. Each one starts with the words, I will, because that's how you really begin the book and remind us of these incredible promises that were given to Abraham.
Exactly. And he said, I will bless you. I'll be your shield. Do not be afraid. I'm great your reward. I. This is a one-sided covenant that God was making to Abraham. It's not, you do this and I will do that. You do this and I'll do that. God says, I am the guarantor of that covenant. I am the initiator of this covenant. I am the one. In fact, that is why he alone, I believe that is the theophany, that's the pre-incarnate Christ, who walked alone between the carcasses when they split them in half, and the shedding of that blood of the covenant, which is really pointing to the cross, that in that shed blood between the two halves of the sacrifice, Christ walked in that blood-stained ground to show that this is a covenant that God is making with Abraham, and he will make sure and that he will absolutely guarantee the success of that covenant, because God is the one who's the maker and the keeper of the covenant.
Well, in chapter 5, you talk about the God who makes covenants. Let's move to that because, covenants between unequals, there's a good example of that, but also this idea of an indelible covenant. This is a concept that we don't hear as much today, and certainly something we need to come back to, and I know that's another reason why you wrote this book. Yes,
and this is the thing that, and the reason we having, and now please forgive me if I'm stepping my bounds here, but we're seeing so many pastors now dropping out the faith and turning their back on the faith. It is because they never understood that God is the God of grace, is the God who called us, the God who keeps us, the God who is so gracious to us, and we, out of absolutely overwhelming gratitude and thanksgiving to that graciousness of God, that grace of God, that we obey, that we serve, that we give, and we do all the other things, not because he did his part, therefore we do our part, and together we get to the whole. No, he did it all. He did it all when he covenanted with Abraham. He did it all on the cross. He did it all when he saved us. We are the fortunate, we are the blessed recipient of that one-sided covenant that God made with us. And that gratitude is what really keeps us, maintain us, until the day we see Jesus face to face. And the more we wake up and rise up to that incredible graciousness of God, the more we would become devoted and committed. It's not a list of do's and don'ts. It's a list of absolute gratitude and thanksgiving to the God who did everything, one-sided covenant, and we are the blessed recipients of it.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll chat for just a few more minutes with Pastor Michael Youssef, Counting Stars in an Empty Sky, Trusting God's Promises for Your Impossibilities. Just covers so many great topics that we've been talking about here in terms of the promises to Abraham, the idea of a God of covenants. What about this idea of failure, maybe even the silence of God, some of these other topics that we sometimes address here on Point of View? This book delves into those as well. So when we come back, we'll chat for a few more minutes with Michael Youssef. Then we'll get into just a few other issues in the news that probably need some clarification, some correction, and then we'll be done for the day. But if you would like to join us, have a comment for Michael Youssef, 1-800-351-1212, or else just sit back and listen as we talk about his book, Counting Stars in an Empty Sky. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
If you've ever listened to Dennis Prager's radio program, you know that he often talks about the difference between liberals and conservatives. And you would also know that he dedicates 1 hour to what he calls the happiness hour, where he explores why people are happy or unhappy. So it's not surprising that he recently wrote a commentary on the subject, Liberals and Conservatives Are Unhappy for Different Reasons. He says that unhappy conservatives generally believe they are unhappy because life is difficult or tragic or because they made some unwise decisions in life. Liberals are unhappy generally because they believe they have been persecuted. A left-wing woman may attribute her unhappiness to American society's patriarchy or misogyny. She therefore feels oppressed. He also argues that the more left-wing blacks will attribute his or her unhappiness to racism. He has noticed that black conservatives have a much happier disposition than left-wing blacks. He's also found that a cheerful black caller to his radio program is almost always a conservative. Near the end of his commentary, he gives a personal example. His father, an Orthodox Jew, wrote his college senior thesis on the subject of anti-Semitism in America. His father was well aware of bigotry in this country, but still reminded Dennis Prager and his brother that American Jews are the luckiest Jews in history because they're Americans. Prager says, "I therefore never knew what it was like to walk around thinking most of the people I met hated me. That alone contributed to my happiness." He correctly concludes that unhappy Americans on the right blame the problems inherent to life and blame themselves. Unhappy Americans on the left blame America. This simple formula explains so much. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pastor Michael Youssef with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Counting Stars in an Empty Sky, published by Baker. Be looking for it in your local bookstore. It should be coming out next month. And you talked about failure, and I think that might be good to come back to one of the chapters on the failure of faith, because you talk about going down to Egypt, and we, of course, have talked about some people that have been high-profile individuals or pastors or others that have walked away from their faith. We certainly recognize that even apart from these high-profile individuals, we have a number of people coming in the front door, but a lot of them are sneaking out the back door. So what about this idea of faith and failure? How does that relate?
Well, I think it all goes back to a very thorough biblical illiteracy that is taking place. We do not have Bible preachers, and please forgive me ahead of time, in the pulpits we have motivational preachers, motivational speakers. And when the faith is built on anything other than the very solid, inerrant Word of God, the slightest bit of intimidation by the secular media, by the secular society, by the postmodern culture, they immediately abandon ship. That is really tragic. And the problem with that is that when you see a big name or somebody says, I'm abandoning the faith, what the ripple effect to all the people in the pews and to the seekers, those who are really genuinely searching and those who are weak believers, it is humongous. But nonetheless, I think that in the end, it's one of two things. Either they have never been believers to begin with and they've been pretenders, or if they are believers, they'll be like Abraham going down to Egypt, causing almost a utter disaster, and then God intervenes and he brings them back if they're part of the elect. And so, either way, I just think that we need to really be. I'm convinced that if the statistics are right, 18% of Christians read the Bible regularly. Then the preachers will wave big black Bibles but never preach it. We're going to see more and more and more of this, not less. And so we need to get back to the authority, the authenticity of God's Word, God's self-revelation. And that's why I write books like this one, because it takes people back to the original covenant that God made with Abraham, which we are the direct people who've been blessed by it, because Jesus Christ, the seed of Abraham, is the one who received the fulfillment of the promise that the Father made to Abraham.
And again, we talk about the 7 promises to Abraham. And of course, in this section here, it's the 6 steps to Egypt and relying on human logic. Abraham certainly did that, ceased to worship, becoming prideful, self-sufficient, of course, lying and all the rest. And so just the first part of the book is so good because it talks about the promises, it talks about the failure. But what about this question that you address a little bit later? And that is the question of kind of the silence of God. This is a question that not only do we deal with here in the 21st century, it was a question, no doubt, that Abraham dealt with as well, didn't he?
No doubt, 25 years. And, but I also point out that there are 5 times when God seemed to be silent, and I delineate each one of them.
Yes.
Is it a silence of judgment that's about to really get on the way? Is it a silence of His mercy? Is it a silence of testing us? It is a silence of teaching us to just wait for Him. Is it the silence of His love, that out of love that He's being silent? Whatever reason God is silent, and I talk to individuals who are listening to us right now, Kerby, there are some people probably saying, God, where are you? I'm in pain. I'm in suffering. I don't understand. Where are you? And just remember that as you pick up this book and you read the different ways in which God in the Scripture, because everything I have here from the Scripture, I'm not smart enough to write things that from me, but it's all from the Scripture. When we see God, at least in 5 different occasions that I expound in this particular chapter, where God was silent, and sometimes it causes confusion. I did myself. I looked up to the heaven in one situation. It was so traumatic and literally made me despair of life itself back in my early walk with Christ. And I said, where are you, God? Why are you silent? Why are you not listening? The psalmist said the same thing.
Yes.
And in reality, God is saying, I may be silent, but here's why I'm silent. And I expound all this in that chapter you just pointed to, because we need to know if we're experiencing the silence of God. Don't always feel guilty because God is angry with me. Is God mad with me? No, not necessarily that at all. But it could be a whole lot of other reasons, and we need to get into the Scripture and know why when God becomes silent at those times, and that to strengthen our faith. In fact, when Job was saying, God, why are you silent? What God was wanting to prove to Satan, that my boy Job, he's going to come through with flying colors. Satan wanted to bring Job to the point of distrusting God, and Job wouldn't do it. And so in the midst of God's silence and your suffering, God is working on your behalf, and He's going to bring double blessing in the end, and we're all going to be rejoicing in heaven in the presence of God, reigning and ruling with Him. And that's something we need to be thinking about. I was just asked on another program recently, and somebody says, well, what motivates you at 71? You're going full blast. I said, the audience of one. I'm going to have that audience. Every one of us will. And I want to be able to say, Lord Jesus, thank you for saving me. You did it all, and I'm just thankful that you took me for the ride.
That's so good. And again, this whole idea in the silence of God, a lot of people think it's God's judgment or testing, and that may be, but there are other examples. But let's end on a positive note, and that is the friend of God, because we talk about what a friend we have in Jesus, but the fact that we can call God our friend and that God knows us better than we know ourselves, and we can have a personal relationship with God. Michael, you know as well as I do that our Muslim friends can't say that Allah is a close friend of theirs, but we can call God our Father, can't we?
Absolutely. And Jesus said, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. And that is absolutely something makes me go on my knees and on my face. As it, God, you're the creator of the universe. You flung the galaxies, and billions of them, and you are the God who controls the world and the universe, and yet you call me a friend, a fallen, weak, clay feet human being who's loved by you, redeemed by you. That really humbles us to know that God wants to call us friends. And we miss out a great deal on the incredible blessings by not spending intimate time with Him on a daily basis and on a regular basis. A friend speaks to a friend listens to a friend feels for the friend, and that is what we have in God. I have some dear Muslim friends. Some are really lovely people, but they cannot, because they do not know God on a personal way. In fact, out of the 99 names of God in Islam, the word love, the name love is not one of them. Why? Because they tell you that love is a mark of vulnerability, and far be it from Allah to be vulnerable. He can be merciful, yes, but He also, as they have in their book, says He can lead and mislead. My goodness gracious. Our gracious God misleads us. No. You're worshiping the wrong God. We don't worship. Come to the God. And that's why we're seeing thousands of people today. Through our television station, Kingdom Set, we are seeing thousands and thousands of people from all over the Arab world and said, I want to know this God who wants to be my friend, the God who loves me, the God who died for me. And they are absolutely shaken to their boots when they come to know Jesus, because their God is a God who just can't wait for them to do something wrong and whack them. But our God is the God who's waiting for us to obey Him in order He might praise us and encourage us and motivates us and continues to call us a friend.
Let me just mention that we have a link to, of course, the website, Leading the Way, or you can simply go to ltw.org. We have a link to his Facebook page as well as his Twitter feed if you'd like to know more about that television program, the radio program, which is not only heard in this country but around the world, and I certainly appreciate the outreach that you've had in the Middle East and others. And if you'd like to know more about this book, which is coming out shortly, Counting Stars in an Empty Sky, Trusting God's Promise for Your Impossibilities, Pastor Michael Youssef has been with us, a good friend, and it is always a delight to have you on the program Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. I feel the same way. I thank God for you and for your incredible strategic ministry.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we will spend some time getting into a couple of the issues in the news. And if you find yourself saying, I'm interested in that book, I'd like to know more about some of the things that Michael Youssef is doing, just go to Leading the Way or just go to ltw.org. Or if you say, well, I won't have a chance to go right now, will it be on your website? Yes, it is. And it'll be there all day until tomorrow when we do another program. So if you want more information, you want to find links to the book or any of the other material we've talked about, it's all at the website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we have some things to deal with, and we will do so right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you just joined up with us, about an hour ago, we talked with Samuel Rodriguez. I'm so tempted to call him that all the time. But again, National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference. Pastor Rodriguez went to the border and gave us some perspective on the so-called border crisis and what we could do to make a difference. We've also talked with Martin Mawyer about the Muslim Community Patrol. Let me just mention again, if you go to our website and click on the See More button, we have a section there where you can actually download that special report, and then you can pass it on to others as a PDF, or else you can print it out. If you do, make sure you got enough paper. It's 16 pages, although I printed it front and back, and then 34 different references. And then we just talked with Michael Youssef about his book, Counting Stars in an Empty Sky. Let me get into a couple of issues. One that I haven't talked about, maybe we'll get into it more tomorrow, with Jeremy Dice and Dr. Merrill Matthews, but the twin, or the brother, I should say, of Julian Castro, Joaquin Castro, decided that he would actually reveal the names of the individuals that had given the maximum amount to Donald Trump in the Trump campaign. And so as a result, revealed that, and that's what's called doxing, if you're not familiar with that. And it oftentimes leads to individuals that want to harm an individual. It allows individuals to be harassed. And so this has been something which, I'll give some credit. MSNBC actually has called him out for doing that. But many of the other groups that tend to be more liberal-oriented say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, here's what's wrong with it. And that is the fact that, indeed, what it has done in the past is open people up to all sorts of kind of abuse. There have been people that have been forced out of their job for the, if you will, the penalty of having donated to a marriage amendment that was on the ballot in California. And there have been all sorts of people who have lost business and had people boycott their business. And indeed, if you want to go back and find the original tweet by Joaquin Castro, it said, sad to see so many San Antonios in 2019 as maximum donors to Donald Trump. It is actually dispiriting to discover Republicans actually exist in your city, you might ask. But nevertheless, Mark Davis puts it this way. As he summarized this, he says, this list mentions, first of all, 2 restaurant owners. Okay, what do you think is going to happen if some of the liberal groups want to come after the restaurant, boycott the restaurant, whatever? They also mention, it also mentions a realtor by name and Twitter handle. And it has, of course, this list of, as he said, the, quote, unpardonable, unquote, a sin of holding beliefs that differ from his. And so this act of doxing, Mark Davis says, is now common among many on the left. In this case, it does not include the full home addresses or cell numbers, but that's sort of immaterial because, as he points out, any teenager with a smartphone probably could come up with those. So we've had people actually going to homes, including, as I mentioned just the other day, the home of the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, and the home in the past of a variety of other individuals of some kind of note. Tucker Carlson comes to mind and others. So that is the case. And then after all of this, Joaquin Castro, instead of saying, well, maybe I made a mistake, he was actually making it worse because here as his quote, their contributions are fueling a campaign of hate that labels Hispanic immigrants as invaders. Yet, as a cherry on top, that completes the despicable act of unwarranted charge of complicity. And, of course, what he's been doing is traveling through some of the talk shows trying to defend what I think is the indefensible. So some people have thought that this may be the dirty trick of 2019, and I think maybe it qualifies. So at least I want to put that on the table. We may have more to say about that tomorrow. But as we wind down this hour, And this last half hour, I wanted to come back to a phrase that has been, I think, rightly attributed to Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, that you are free to believe whatever you want to believe. You're free to have your own opinions, but you're not free to have your own data and your own facts. So the bottom line is that there are times when people honestly think something is right and they're wrong. And these not only are harmful in terms of the misperception people have about America, but it's also affecting the misperception that these voters might have in the next election. Since we've been talking about shootings, let me come back to a piece that actually came out a while ago, but I saw it posted again on Facebook, and it reminded me maybe to focus on that. And that is this piece that was in the Washington Post entitled, "Most Americans Incorrectly Think Gun Murder Rates Have Gotten Worse, Not Better." Now, the point it was making is as we look at those surveys, some of these key demographic groups have such an inaccurate misperception that misperception could even affect the votes. And again, people are free to believe anything they want, even if it's erroneous. But the fact is, you are free to have your own opinions. You're not free to have your own facts. And the group that was, I think, most illustrated by having such a widely divergent and inaccurate view were a group of individuals who oftentimes have been seen as kind of the swing voters. That would be the suburban and small town women who were 29 points more likely to say that the gun murder rate is now higher than it was in 1994. Why was 1994 picked? Well, that's because that's when, in an effort to, quote, fight crime, then President Bill Clinton was able to get past an assault weapons ban. And yes, indeed, the murder rate went down, but then even after the assault weapon ban was removed and it was no longer in effect, the murder rate still went down. And I think it illustrates that the reason it was dropping were for reasons apart from a weapons ban. As a matter of fact, as I pointed out yesterday, even the RAND Corporation, as well as some of the research from CDC and others, all pretty much come to the conclusion that it really was not that effective. That is, the assault weapons ban effective on decreasing some of this as well. But in this particular article, it reminds us that if we go back and look at the data from the FBI, they, of course, keep track of the type of weapon, show the drop in significant, and there was a very significant decrease since 1993 and 1994 in the number of murders. But that's only half of the issue, because the real question was, has the murder rate gone down? And that's dropped even more precipitously. The number of murders is a murder rate is a number of murders as function of population. Well, the population's increased since that time. So as a result, the drop is even steeper. In 1994, in round numbers, you had a rate of 6 firearm murders per 100,000. In 2017, for which we have the last good statistics, although we'll soon have the ones for 2018, it was down to about 3 murders for 100,000. In other words, almost cut in half. The point I'm making is, first of all, it's sad that any murder takes place, but the reality is that we live in a time right now in which the murder rate has dropped significantly, and yet most Americans, especially some of those who may actually determine whether or not Donald Trump is reelected or whether the Democratic candidate is elected, have perhaps the most divergent view about some of those issues, and just a good illustration of the need to educate the American people. Just before we take a break, let me just mention, too, there was another good piece that came out yesterday in the Daily Signal. Guns save these Americans from assault and robbery. And the point that is in this particular summary, and it talks about examples over the last couple of months, but it gives the overall perspective, which sometimes gets lost in all of this conversation, because the assumption has always been that if we can get more guns out of society, then indeed there will be less guns used for unlawful purposes and less people will be killed. But this particular part of this goes back to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, finding that almost and again, I'm quoting from them now, almost all national studies of defensive gun uses have found that firearms are used in self-defense between 500,000 and 3 million times each year in the United States. By the way, that low number comes from one that really discounted a lot of those. The high number comes from, I suspect, John Lott. And if indeed you trust him, as we do, we've interviewed him many times before, that means that about 3 million times every single year, a person who displays a weapon or uses it prevents an assault, a robbery, a murder, or at least ends the possible danger. And so that's just another kind of fact or figure that is out there, but oftentimes a little bit ignored. We come back on a move from the issue of shootings into some other areas where the opinions people hold to are, frankly, quite inaccurate. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the things I thought I might spend just a little bit of time talking about real quickly is this idea of censorship. And the reason for it is yesterday you probably heard me talk about and even quote from Dennis Prager, "Don't let Google get away with censorship." And that was something that appeared in the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago. So I open up my news feed today, and since I do get material from the Columbia Journalism Review, imagine my surprise after we have documented in a variety of different ways and even have a section in my latest social media booklet that we've made available to you, the examples of censorship. And imagine my surprise when I open up this particular piece in the Columbia Journalism Review by Matthew Ingram, who turns out, I guess he's the editor of the Journalism Review. The myth of social media anti-conservative bias refuses to die. What? And the point he is trying to make here is that there is almost no evidence of any conservative actually facing bias in Facebook, Twitter, or Google. And he says this apparently with a straight face. I keep waiting for the joke to land in light of all the stories, in light of the fact that there was Senate hearing on it in the rest, and actually says that this is a piece of it's a conspiracy theory, he says, and it's a conspiracy theory promoted by alt-right groups, which then one of the groups he mentions is Diamond and Silk, and I can't even list them as an alt-right duo. They're interesting African-American women, make some interesting statements, and then conservative groups and the White House. And then he goes through and dismisses this without necessarily more than just, they're making these claims, they're making these statements, and it goes on for a couple of pages. And I can't see anywhere in here where he mentions anybody of note other than the Trump White House. And at one point he does mention Sean Hannity, but that's a quote, actually. But he doesn't mention Dennis Prager. I'll think this through for just a minute. Dennis Prager's in the Wall Street Journal, right? Okay, that's 2 days ago. You would think even if you wrote the article, and I understand you write articles ahead of time and then they finally land, but you would think that since he's the editor of that, he might point out that since I've written this article, there has been a very maybe obscure, uninteresting, interesting, or maybe even poorly supported, whatever, word he'd want to use, piece by Dennis Prager in the Wall Street Journal. But he never mentions Dennis Prager, and I'm thinking, really? This is the man that has brought lawsuits. This is the man who has testified in the Senate. This is the individual who has had, at the time, what was so intriguing is I think he said he had actually 56 of his videos that are on a YouTube restricted list. And I just heard one that we'll talk about maybe in just a minute. The most recent one just came out, the Charlottesville Lie. That one has now been restricted. So I think that gets up to 57 of his videos are restricted. And somehow he doesn't even know about that, or at least doesn't say anything about that. And so I come back to the Dennis Prager piece that we posted yesterday, and I even have a commentary coming out next week, in which, again, he just gives us a list of some of those that have not been allowed to have free access. They're actually restricted, and because that means certain individuals that have any kind of parental advisory or those kinds of things, they can't even get to those videos. And these are videos by, for example, former Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz, Churchill biographer Andrew Roberts, even the Somali American Muslim who's been speaking out on women's rights, like I.E. Hersey Ali, and even Manhattan Institute's Heather McDonald's been on the program. Many of these people have been on the program with us. These are our kind of people, and these have all been restricted. And nevertheless, it's just an illustration of that. We even in his article reminds us that when he was actually testifying in front of the Senate, they have never, that is YouTube and Google, have never said why they restrict some of those various videos, except in that particular Senate hearing, they did say that they restricted the 10 Commandments video because it mentioned the word murder. I'm not making this up. And they were apparently not joking. Well, he was having a little bit of fun with them and was joking, and that is Dennis Prager then assured the Senate committee that he'd be glad to release a Google-friendly video called The 9 Commandments. This is how bad it gets. But here's the interesting irony. The Columbia Journalism Review obviously is a little disconnected from Columbia University, but not a whole lot, because in this article by Dennis Prager, he quotes from a professor at Columbia University who actually did a study of political bias on Twitter. and concluded that of the 22 prominent politically active individuals who actually were suspended by Twitter, 21 of them supported Donald Trump. So 21 out of 22. So can we just, have Columbia talk to Columbia here? I mean, I don't get this. Columbia Journalism Review, Columbia University, they're not even necessarily talking to each other. And since I mentioned Dennis Prager, let's take the most recent one that he has posted. And that is that, as I mentioned, there is the so-called lie, and he thinks it's one of the biggest lies, that Donald Trump actually said that he actually referred to those fine people and that he was really referring to Nazis and Ku Klux Klan. We've talked about this before. I have a file with me that's called Fine People because I know this surfaces in the media. There are probably, as Dennis Prager points out, tens of millions of individuals who think they know that. There is the former vice president who, even when he announced he was running for office, used that phrase. And so the video, which interesting enough has just come out here, is called the Charlottesville Lie, in proving, I think, for any fair-minded person that the president was not saying that Nazis were fine people. And the video is actually presented by the CNN political commentator Steve Cortes, and he says he's kind of a voice of courage in the herd known as the mainstream American media. And this one, he says, is of all the 300-plus videos that Prager University has created, this is the one he most wants Americans to watch, because he says the harm that the media and others on the left have done and continue to do this country are charging the president with praising Nazis and other white supremacists, and he says that's incalculable. It only served to inflame and divide Americans, the tens of millions who believe the lie and the tens of millions who know the truth. But the bottom line is, in case you were wondering, as I just alluded to a minute ago, Google decided to place this video, the Charlottesville Lie, on its restricted list as well, just 2 weeks after the Senate hearing in which a Google representative swore under oath that Google doesn't censor on the basis of political views. And he says the ease with which the left lies is breathtaking. Well, that's just a little bit of a look at some of the things that we have covered today. My commentary today is also by Dennis Prager. Interesting enough, it's been a good Dennis Prager day, I guess. Unhappy for different reasons, and you can read that to, if nothing else, remind yourself that one of the reasons why sometimes people are happy or unhappy has to do with whether or not they want to change their own circumstances or whether they want to blame someone else. Very reminiscent of another Dennis Prager video that Jordan Peterson has done, in which he says you can't really change other people, you can only change yourself, and sometimes when you change yourself, you'll be a happier person. Well, that's all we have for today. Tomorrow is our weekend edition. We look forward to the opportunity to spend some time with Jeremy Dice, as well as with Dr. Merrill Matthews, and want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. And hope you'll join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.